I'm back with another IB history lesson. Today we're going to be covering the Civil Rights Movement section for protest and action. The desegregation of public facilities, transportation, and services, alongside the consolidation of voting rights for African Americans, prompted most collective action at the hands of the Civil Rights Movement. The Montgomery Bus Boycott of 1955 was the first community action that brought nationwide attention to the civil rights struggle and was the first sustained large-scale community-wide protest by African Americans in a southern city. It triggered the emergence of the charismatic 27-year-old civil rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and catalyzed the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, the organization that would often lead to significant protests and demonstration over the next decades. When we deal with a historical background for the protest and action section of the civil rights movement, we have to begin with the NAACP. In 1946, attorneys William Hastie and Thurgood Marshall argued that the Commerce Clause of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution made segregation of interstate bus travel unconstitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed, striking down a Virginia law. In 1947, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, conducted freedom rides on interstate buses. In 1953, a bus boycott in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, resulted in a partial integration of city buses. In 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old African-American girl, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman. So by the time Rosa Parks was arrested for the same crime on the 1st of December 1955, a series of civil disobedient acts by several African-American women had occurred. The Montgomery Bus Boycott was a grassroots movement. The main protagonist, Rosa Parks, had worked actively for civil rights for 2 decades. To ride a bus, African Americans had to pay at the driver at the front of the bus, exit the bus, and then re-enter through the rear door. Parks refused to leave the bus after paying. She was forced out of the bus, and then the driver, James F. Blake, drove off, leaving Parks behind. It was after this incident that she officially joined the NAACP and was elected the Montgomery Chapter Secretary, a dangerous job that required her to document violent acts and investigate murder, voter intimidation, and rape. It was the same bus driver who later got her arrested and taken to jail for refusing her seat. On December 2nd, the WPC, led by Joanne Robinson, decided to organize a one-day bus boycott. Over 50,000 leaflets were printed to publicize the event and were distributed in less than 24 hours. 3 demands were made: a pledge from city and bus company officials that African Americans would be treated with courtesy, a revision of the city code that would seat white Americans from front to back and African Americans from back to front with no reserved areas, and the hiring of African American drivers for routes that carried all or mostly African American passengers. The boycott was successful, but there was no action from the city company or a bus company, and Parks was found guilty and fined. It had to continue. Montgomery civil rights leaders, including Everett and Athey, Nixon, Lewis, and King, formed Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. It launched King as a national figure. Until June 1956, the federal court in Montgomery ruled that Alabama's bus segregation laws violated the 14th Amendment. After appeals, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the ruling. Desegregated buses were now a thing. 3 lessons are learned from Montgomery. First, it transformed the attitude of Southern African Americans from one of fear of white Americans to a growing defiance. It showed that a united African American community could challenge Jim Crow. It also elevated Martin Luther King Jr. to a national figure, as well as promoting nonviolence resistance as a means of achieving racial equality, and sparked the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We also have another form of protest, which was freedom rights. They started in 1961. The freedom rights were a way of exerting pressure on governments at all levels, local, state, and federal, but predominantly the federal government. This was to enforce the right of African Americans to use interstate transportation unencumbered by segregation and segregationists. President John F. Kennedy takes office, and the African American community tests his commitment. Two mixed groups of African Americans and white passengers would travel from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Louisiana, via the Deep South, passing through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. One group of men and women would ride a Greyhound bus, and the second one would travel trailways. A biracial contingent of 13 Freedom Riders, 6 white and 7 African Americans, began their trip on May 4, 1961, just 2 weeks after the failed Bay of Pigs effort to overthrow Fidel Castro, and as President Kennedy was preparing for his first meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. As the first bus, the Greyhound, pulled up to the bus terminal in Anniston, Alabama, 30 to 50 men armed with sticks and metal bars surrounded the bus. Police stayed away from the terminal by order of Anniston officials. Rocks were thrown through bus windows and 2 tires were slit. A driver steered the damaged bus away from the terminal, taking the road to Birmingham. 40 cars followed, and when the bus tires went flat, the driver stopped and they were surrounded by a mob. A white male passenger with a gun held them at bay for a few minutes. He was an undercover member of the Alabama Highway Patrol. He was ordered by Governor John Patterson, who was an outspoken segregationist. An incendiary bomb was thrown and the passengers streamed out and they were attacked. However, the patrolman who was undercover, his name was Eli Cowling, threw a warning shot in the air, and with it, it ended the quarrel. This is how the bus looked after the quarrel ended. So imagine the tension between the citizens and the Freedom Riders. Now, with the Trailway bus, it had an issue in Birmingham. A KKK mob of 30 men armed with baseball bats, chains, and pipes first attacked reporters and news photographers before beating the Freedom Riders and several bystanders. After 50 minutes, the mob melted away when the police arrived. One of the casualties was James Peck, who needed 53 stitches. And the FBI had been informed, the governor had been informed, local police had been informed, but again, federalism takes its toll. And so the White House got word, and nobody would issue a public opinion. And this led to basically no bus driver wanting to continue with the Freedom Riders because there were a lot of safety issues and there was bombings, right? So basically the journey ended for most of them. However, we have another group of people entering a Freedom Ride campaign, which was the SNCC Riders. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leaders John Lewis and Diane Nash immediately organized a second trip of 10 riders, many of them fellow students from Fisk College in Nashville, Tennessee. And before leaving, they wrote their testaments, which is kind of funny because, I mean, they're going on a suicide mission, basically. President Kennedy was furious, and they basically ordered Diane Nash to stop the new Freedom Riders. However, they couldn't do anything, and the administration ordered a Greyhound bus to help out with the Freedom Rides. And so they ended up going from Nashville to Montgomery, Alabama, and upon arrival, they were beaten. And this ended up with a rally led by Martin Luther King, and a mob surrounded the church in which they were in. There was no presidential response, and the National Guard of Alabama had to be called to establish order. The Kennedy administration pressed the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, for a ruling, and on September 22nd, the ICC issued a ban on segregation on interstate travel. This was the biggest success of the Freedom Rider. In terms of legislation, we begin with the Freedom Summers. The Freedom Summer was a campaign proposed by Robert Moses. He was an SNCC member. He was a student who basically wanted to combine voter education, registration, and political activism. It also formed freedom schools to teach literacy and civics to both adults and children, and volunteers were fully integrated. They followed this concept of a beloved community, which was an ideal popularized by Martin Luther King that comes from a love and a commitment to nonviolence. They wanted the beloved community to not tolerate any form of discrimination, to fight poverty, hunger, and homelessness. And there were a lot of disputes, whether local or international, um, actors would be resolved through the process of conflict resolution with the dual goals of peace and justice. The campaign centered around middle and upper class white Americans because it was the only way for the federal government to actually get involved. And the project paved way to two major legislative actions, which was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These are key legislative acts that help pave the way for the rights of African Americans in the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Basically, relying on the 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the Act encompassed voting rights, public accommodation, the segregation of public facilities, limits on discrimination within federally funded programs, employment discrimination, and authorized higher court review of district courts. So basically, it was a huge, huge change for African American rights. And if your establishment fell under a federal law as a public facility, then you were under interstate commerce clauses, and therefore you have to comply to desegregation. The act came about as a result of the constant and rising pressure created by a decade of actions and events, including the bus boycotts, business boycotts, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, and other demonstrations and marches that occurred across the United States. On June 11, 1963, in the midst of the continual demonstrations that were happening across, Kennedy went on national television to propose a comprehensive bill covering discrimination in public accommodations and employment, as well as strengthening voting rights and the enforcement mechanisms for those. Nonetheless, the passage of the bill through Congress was far from guaranteed. After Kennedy's assassination, the made little progress at the hands of President Johnson. In Congress, amendments and committee work dismantled the bill and redefined it, adding the word sex to Title VII, Equal Employment Opportunities. This basically made gender a protected class along with race, ethnicity, and religion, and raised a question of whether they wanted to pass the bill or not, because they were added another layer to the race issue. A 3-month delay occurred in the Senate due to a filibuster by a bloc of Southern senators. This is a key term. You need to remember filibuster. A filibuster occurs when one or more senators continually speak on the floor of the Senate so that no votes can be taken. United States Senate rules at that time allowed for non-stop debate. So basically you're speaking non-stop, unless 2/3 of the senators vote to end the debate. This vote is called a cloture vote, and it rarely happens because usually Congress is pretty much biased. Presently, 60 out of the 100 votes are required for the cloture. However, on July 1964, after regionally divisive votes in both houses of Congress, the president decided to jump in and he signs the bill into an act, and we have this major piece of legislation passing. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In January 1965, the CSLC, led by Mr. King, built upon previous voting rights work by the SNCC and opened a voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama. As with previous voter registration efforts, responses by the white community included threats and violence. In response to a fatal shooting on March 7, which would become known as Bloody Sunday, as a group of more than 500 assembled on this bridge in Selma, Alabama, and the police and Alabama patrolmen responded to the beginning of the protest with tear gas, billy clubs, and riders on horseback started pulling out bullwhips, and more than 50 people were injured, and images of the beating appeared on evening news and and national news across the country. The result of this event was basically the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We can see some images here of the actual footage of this massacre. It's pretty similar to what we see on national television today, 2020. Um, so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is passed and signed into law in August 1965. Very legislative time frame of 4 months. It's super fast. The act outlawed literacy test, and it basic the act outlawed literacy test and directed the U.S. Department of Justice to challenge poll taxes, which it actually did. The act also gave the Attorney General the power to assign federal examiners to observe and direct voter registration, and where less than half of the eligible residents were registered to vote, there was more focus. Within 2 years, more than half of the Southern African Americans of legal age were registered to vote, and in Mississippi, the percentage of eligible African Americans registered to vote moved from the lowest from the lowest in the South to the highest in the South. So basically, everybody in the South started registering to vote because they had the opportunity to do so. This was their right. Again, we have President Johnson signing the bill into law after Congress filibusters it. And our famous bibliography. Thank you, Mark Rogers and Peter Clinton, for their fantastic book. And we recognize the authors of all visual and auditory content in this presentation. Thank you.